So, introducing Mary, as I said, she's with Stephenson Halliday. She's a landscape architect, and we thought it would be interesting today to talk a bit about landscape. A brief sort of sketch over her career. She started out initially looking at planting design, and then moved into landscape and visual impact assessment. She's done LVIA projects of all sizes, shapes throughout the UK, and we'll maybe pick up on that through the discussion. And just to give a little bit of an example, our Scottish audience will be familiar, particularly those involved in house building, that there's been litigation around the Gladman development at Carse Meadow at Quarriers Village. And Mary, I don't think, is taking any credit for the litigation, or at least I hope not. But she was involved in the master plan and the LVIA for that development. So welcome, Mary. And just to start us off, I was mentioning there landscape and visual impact assessment, LVIA, getting into the acronyms early. And you'd also mentioned to me TVIA, Townscape and Visual Impact Assessment. Can you maybe give us a bit of an explanation, because some of the audience might not have been involved in these sorts of things? What is the role of LVIA, TVIA? What's involved in that?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's quite nice to be able to talk about some of these things from scratch. So the point of, I mean, LVIA, we'll come back to TVIA later because it's easier to explain once you've done the one first. I once had to describe for my 4-year-old son, when he'd first gone to school, his primary teacher sent him home with his first ever piece of homework, which was ask your parents what their job is. And I thought, oh, how do you explain LVIA to a 4-year-old? So what I said was, I go out, walk up a hill, I pretend that there's something there that I can't see, and I write a story and draw some pictures about it. That is essentially what we do. And obviously it's a lot more complicated and technical. So, you know, a lot of it is about what will it look like and helping people to understand that. Visualization is part of that, but a lot of it's just describing, so to draw out the important points. I think the bit that people struggle with a bit is landscape character, which is about what a place is like to be in, what's special about it, what's important, what makes it a particular kind of place and not somewhere else. So what makes Scotland different from Devon, etc. That is a bit more nebulous, and I think that's one thing that people sometimes struggle with as a concept. And then also, obviously, we deal with designated landscapes and what's valued about them, and try and explain how that will be affected by a development. So it's all really about putting some substance to and trying to explain clearly what will be different if this development happened, rather than leaving things the same as they are now, just to help decision makers reach a view on what's important. And TVIA is only about doing that in an urban context rather than a rural context.
Yeah. I love the way you describe it as telling a story. That feels as though it's probably underselling the amount of work that's involved. Maybe just getting into that a bit. To me as a lawyer, it feels like a lot of what goes into an LVIA involves using various computer techniques in terms of, you know, sort of wireframes and zones of visual influence and that sort of thing. So can you maybe touch a bit on, well, you're telling a story, but what are you using to actually, I suppose it's actually find out what the story is you're going to tell?
Yeah, when I used ZT, zones of theoretical visibility modelling, probably more than most landscape architects. That's partly because I know how to do it myself and I know how they work. Whereas a lot don't, they rely on technicians to do it. And I think that helps because I trust them. I know what they do. I will usually do that first before I do anything else, because it helps me narrow things down, because I know that if you can't see it, there are whole areas that I just don't have to worry about. So that's what I'll do first, to narrow down what the issues are likely to be. And then I start looking at the areas where you might be able to see it from, to see, okay, well, what's important in these places? What do I need to think about? Is there a designated area? Is there a conservation area in this nearby village? Am I going to need to think about that? So that's, for me, that's one of the key techniques that I use. And then obviously these days, when I first started, very little information was available as data and on the internet, whereas now so much is. So we're able to do a lot of our information gathering about where are the landscape character areas, where are the designations, by drawing data from various places and combining it in GIS. That just replaces what we used to do with bits of paper and tracing paper and felt tips, to be honest. It's the same thing. It just involves a computer instead of a pen and a bit of paper. And then the other techniques that we use, yes, are visualization techniques. And they are all about really working out, trying to show other people where things will be in the view. The reason why this job is done by landscape architects is because we can imagine it without needing the visual aids necessarily. So generally, the purpose of the visualization is to show other people what we're on about.
And jumping into the thing we always talk about, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. If it is all subjective and about judgment, what is the point of LVIA?
To put some structure around it, I think, yes, it is all subjective about judgment, but actually, through all the years that this particular approach has been evolving, and people have been, the first tries at doing LVIA were quite some time ago. What's been come out is a few common principles in terms of the way people perceive things, the way these things can be explained, because I think the difficulty with landscape is a lot of it is emotive. And what we're trying to do is to say, well, this is how most people would feel. This is how most people would perceive it. There has become the fact that there is a degree of commonality between all the people that do this kind of assessment. It enables us to sort of set a framework around that and explain it rather than just saying, well, I think this. And it enables a discussion to be had and to draw out the points. And there is a certain degree of consensus. So if you work with other people who do LVIA, you'll see that we tend to share, we will make common or similar judgments about similar things. They don't tend to be wildly different. There's always a degree of debate, and that is where some of the subjectivity comes in. But I think the way it works is to try and have a structured conversation rather than, we don't expect to be right. I think is probably the best way of putting it. It's to set out a structure to enable people to make decisions, because otherwise the diversity of opinion is so big that how do you make any sense of it?
Because that's one of the things I've always been conscious of is local people will quite often value their local landscape, and that is perfectly appropriate. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but it's then putting that into context.
Yeah, and that's essentially what we do. So yes, we work on the idea that everybody does value their local landscape, but actually we just need to take a step back, think about the decisions that have to be made in terms of development, and it's got to go here or somewhere else. Well, let's talk about what if it went here. What would that mean? And that's what we do. And then actually you could compare that to someone going, well, if it went somewhere else, what would that mean? Yeah. And you can have a directly comparable conversation about those two potential scenarios.
Can I jump in with a question? We've got a question already. So, which is, if an LVI takes a view as one that most people would see it, then does that mean that landscape architects and LVIs should take account of the 79% public support for onshore wind?
Was that George?
Yes. That's impressive.
I believe that, yes, that should be possible. At the moment, that isn't possible. But yes, I agree. I think that should be able to be reflected. And that was the topic of some of what I was talking about at the Scottish Renewables Conference.
And thanks, George, for the question. And just to encourage everyone else to plunge on in and ask stuff. When we were trailing this event, we included a quote from Scottish Planning Policy because as planners, planning lawyers, we always like going back to the source material. And the quote I've got, the planning system should facilitate positive change while maintaining and enhancing distinctive landscape character. That actually sounds like quite a challenge, facilitating positive change, but still maintaining and enhancing distinctive landscape character. Mary, as the landscape architect, you're obviously not involved in the planning decision. You're part of the process towards that. Do you find it hard to persuade communities and politicians that change can be positive in the landscape context?
Yeah, because there tends to be a default position that change is bad. In general, people can be like that with change. We're kind of made that way. But in the context of landscape, because it is so important to people, it affects people's it affects the way people feel on a day-to-day basis. And for so many people, landscape is effectively a comfort blanket. You threaten to do anything or change it in any way, of course you get a negative reaction from the majority of people, and it's not surprising. So yeah, it's always hard, I think, but it's always worth trying to make that case. Sorry, I've just got a slight interruption. And I think it's a question of keep trying to have that conversation, because in the end, if we can't make any change, we can't do anything. so there has to be a degree of rational conversation about it, even actually if the emotional temperature for the people on the receiving end of the change is quite high. It's like persuading anybody to do something difficult. It's always going to be an uphill struggle. I think part of the job of being a landscape architect doing LVI is to be sensitive to that. Yes, we have to make work and make change, but that doesn't mean not taking account of the way people are going to feel about it. So it's that balance.
And it's one of the things I know is a big debate around the wild land concept, that some people are saying it's misguided, because quite often wild land is not in a natural form. It has already been changed by humankind. And I've always found that an interesting perspective, because and I heard what you had to say at the Scottish Renewables Conference that you were mentioning in terms of that, the landscape as we know it and enjoy it and appreciate it, in many instances has already been substantially changed through the years, but we've got used to that.
Yeah, and wildland is a particular example of a certain type of character. So all of the areas of wildland have been designated for that characteristic, that feel of being wild. To a certain degree, it doesn't matter how they got that way. So yeah, I get the academic argument that they've been changed by man, but if you approach it from the landscape character perspective, that doesn't stack up. It's about what they're like now and the various characteristics that they have that make people feel that they're wild. And so, yeah, I mean, it's one of those strange things, because actually it's hard to divorce landscape from people, because if there isn't a person to appreciate a landscape, it doesn't have a character. It doesn't have one all by itself without a person in it. When you come to think about wildland, one of its characteristics is it doesn't have many people in it. So it's quite one of those things that's a bit counterintuitive to weigh. Is like, is its character really important if part of its character is that there aren't any people there to appreciate it? It's a bit of an odd one.
But that's where I've always found it useful, going back to LVIA methodology, the fact that it lays it out, and it's the impact from a particular viewpoint, but then going on and saying which receptors, to use the lingo, are going to be present to see that view, because that then takes you to the magnitude of the impact.
Yeah.
And in a whole variety of assessment, that's what I've always found most useful, is getting towards the you've got to look at the magnitude, because that's the thing that is ultimately going to be the key. And if it's something that is very unlikely to ever happen or only affects a low number of people, you don't necessarily give it much weight.
Yeah, but strictly speaking, we're not allowed to count the number of people. So that's where some of these get quite tricky. Yep. So you could have a significant impact on something that you only expect 3 people a year to ever see, and that's quite difficult to balance at the moment. And again, there's because it's always evolving practice, we're always coming up against new things, and it's just a question of, well, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that question? Is the answer that we're getting at the moment in the way that we're doing things right? And that is the way LVIA practice has evolved all the way through, is people continually questioning, is this right? Is this how we should do it? Is he giving us the right answers? And that's why it's never exact, because it is always evolving and we're always trying to do it better. So yeah, we're on version 3 at the moment. Who knows when version 4 of the guidance will come out, but I'm sure there'll be a version 4, because there are still unanswered questions.
I mentioned in the introduction about the Gladman development at Quarriers. You've been involved in housing. People will have picked up from the discussion already your involvement in wind farms. Maybe just taking those two as examples, because they involve very different impacts. I can remember being at a planning conference back in the early days of wind farms, and a planning officer saying, what you've got to realise for planners, wind farms are different because turbines are big, and then pause for dramatic effect, and they move. And I thought, gosh, actually, when you put it like that, that does make a very important point. It's very different for planners to grapple with, that even a tall building is just a building. But thinking about, housing, wind farms, differing impacts there, what challenges does that pose for you as the landscape architect when you've got to assess those impacts in relation to individual projects?
I I actually don't find assessing different things too challenging. I suppose it's partly because that's what I do all the time. What I actually find challenging is knowing enough about all of the industries that I work in and all of the nations that I work in, because I have to do all of this work in the context of the drivers, economics and cultures of the industries that I'm working with, in terms of working on a project, understanding what mitigation options there might be that I could advise them on. all the planning and guidance context. So I've got to know all of that for every industry that I work in. That is quite challenging because that changes all the time. And so keeping up with all of it. And also the cultural norms of what's okay, what you can change, what you don't touch, changes from industry to industry. So knowing that can be difficult. But actually, in terms of doing the assessment, I find the variety is more helpful than not, because it encourages the constant changing encourages you to think about each project from scratch each time. And the big danger with LVIA is not thinking. Yeah, the big danger is going, oh yeah, I know how to do this. It's yeah. As soon as that happens, it will go wrong. You literally have to be quite paranoid about every little bit for every single assessment. So the constant change is actually really helpful because it makes you look at each viewpoint and go, right, how much is this changing? And you can't, because you're constantly changing, you can never be lazy because you do have to think about it properly, because if you haven't assessed a housing site for the last year, yeah, you're always going to be a little bit rusty. You've got to get your head back in and it makes you think. So I find it useful, actually.
And as a planning lawyer, that's music to the ears, because the thing we always get most nervous about are people that you might end up with on the witness stand who haven't just quite done all the work. They've maybe cut a corner, as you're alluding to, become just a little bit too familiar with the topic, or the ultimate, you discover that they've copied over an old Word document and still have the old project name on it, which you look at and you think, this just is not a good start.
Yeah, no, I find the biggest risk in being an expert is actually becoming an expert. You don't want to be too expert. It's better to be just off the edge so that you're constantly working hard to make sure that you do everything. And then it seems to do the job. So yeah, as I say, I also get bored easily. So I find the variety really interesting. It keeps me interested.
And on wind farms specifically, inevitably landscape and visual impact, a very, very big issue. As some of the audience might be aware, there's a debate at the moment about landscape capacity and sensitivity. Can you maybe explain to us what's the difference between those, capacity on one hand, sensitivity on the other, and why is it a concern?
So landscape sensitivity, it relates to character, and it takes account of two factors. One is how much a particular landscape is valued, and the other is how susceptible it would be to change happening if you put in a particular kind of development. So it's a bit like, would this hurt if I poke it? How much? It's that kind of test. So that's what sensitivity takes account of, and it'll look at, it looks at how well a development will fit with the existing character. Capacity goes a step beyond that, and to make a sensitivity assessment, all you actually need is to know what the type of development is, enough about it to know what type it is, roughly how big it is, and about the receiving landscape. To make a capacity assessment, you need a bit more information, and that requires a consideration of how much of this type of development. So it's a quantitative question. It's how much could I do before some threshold is exceeded. And it fundamentally, you can't make a capacity assessment without a threshold in mind. Whereas you can do a sensitivity assessment without, because the sensitivity assessment is shades of grey. So it's how sensitive is it, not very to really. So capacity assessment differs in that it sets a limit. And that's why there's a concern about it, because actually, in order to do one, you have to have a threshold in mind. But the interesting thing is when you look at capacity assessments, that obviously isn't clearly set out. Yeah. So it's assumed, but actually nobody really knows what it is. And obviously, if you're doing that, to set a threshold, you have to have a context behind it, and there isn't a landscape context for that. So, for instance, how full is too full depends on how much change we find acceptable, and how much change we find acceptable depends on a whole lot of things which aren't in the gift of a landscape architect to explain. Yeah, a change that we don't consider acceptable 10 years ago might be acceptable now for different reasons.
Just picking up on that, maybe George is back again. And it's an interesting point that is it the terminology that's the issue? If you're measuring degrees of adverse impact, are you already starting from the point that it's negative? Should it just be, a description of the effects rather than the impacts, and then leave, the kind of acceptability of that to the decision maker?
If we're talking about sensitivity studies, they're not assessing impacts anyway. So all they're doing is saying is a comparative assessment between. So say I've got 10 different character areas in my district. All it's doing is actually saying, well, if I made this change in this character area here, that will be of less concern because that place is less sensitive than if I made this same change in that character over there. Yeah. So it's literally a sliding scale of this one's probably going to be better than that one. That's all.
But when you're assessing it in terms of is it an adverse impact, or are you just able to, I suppose, take that out of it and just call it there will be an impact, whether it's adverse or not? Back to the kind of beauty being in the eye of the beholder, it will depend who's looking at it.
It's more a measurement of how much how dramatic the change would be. Yeah. So generally it is assumed that change to landscape character is adverse, regardless, full stop. Now, we could have a conversation about that, but that is the general assumption. We're back to people find landscape is, people don't want landscape change. So we still work on that default assumption. You can imagine a world in which everybody said, yes, we absolutely want this landscape to change and we want it to change to this, in which case any change in that direction would be positive. But that situation doesn't come up very much.
They just still sticking kind of on that theme, and in terms of wind farms and wind turbines that we're talking about, Austin Cook is suggesting, would there be more public acceptance of wind turbines if there was a more proactive approach by government in terms of clearer guidance as to where they should be located, rather than what some people perceive to be more piecemeal and reactive?
Well, having worked in Wales, I have to say it doesn't work that way. The Welsh government have policy like that, and it's the NDF has their new development framework. It's just been to the Senate, and a lot of the public comment was, "Why have you chosen us to have be one of the main turbine areas? We don't agree. We don't like that. Why are you focusing them all towards us?" So, to be honest, I don't think it does help. I think it just causes a different group of problems. I think, like a lot of public conversation these days, the conversation about wind turbines and in the landscape is dominated by negative voices. I think positive voices don't want to be targeted by the people who are negative. So I think people do find it a hard thing to support, particularly when it comes down to individual applications. If your neighbours are virulently anti, generally you're just trying not to have an argument with them rather than putting your head above the parapet, I think, for most people.
Do you want to ask me? Do you want me to carry on asking questions?
Yeah, please.
Well, one, and it's a theme that we've kind of touched on in other of our webinars, Mary, in terms of obviously digital, and everybody's kind of been moving to having to do everything online. And Chris Whitehead's asked the question, how easy is it to share visuals with stakeholders online to make sure they're viewed correctly? In face-to-face exhibitions, you can be, explaining them, and you've got fixed size images, and you make sure they're standing in a separate, a certain place. Have you had to adapt how you work if everything's going online?
No, we haven't done. That's an interesting question, though, because it was something I was thinking about just the other day. Because we've reached the stage now where planning applications for wind farms are actually going in with no printed material. We've done consultations and exhibitions, and in some ways, it doesn't. People will look at the images how they look at the images. Mm-hmm. They have all these prescribed sizes, and although it's the guidance, I've never been terribly convinced by it myself. I think people are sensible. They look at the images, and certainly when I'm using them, I don't. I compare the size of the turbines in the picture and the size of a tree in the picture, and then I look up at the landscape and imagine them in. Now, for anybody that can and does do that, it doesn't matter what size they are on the paper or on the screen. I think it's only if you can't do that and you're taking it completely literally that it makes it difficult what size the printing is. Otherwise, it makes things more accessible because people can blow them up or reduce them to see what they want to see. So I think in some ways it's good that we're going online, but it really does depend how the debate proceeds from here, because a lot of those standards have been driven by some quite pernickety and pedantic things about photography and how people should hold the paper. Again, which I say I've never been particularly convinced by myself, but it's the guidance, and so we follow it.
Another question from this time from Andrew Raymond is about, and this is something I find quite strange when you're doing landscape character assessments, or you're looking at something, some of them are very, very old, and mm-hmm. should be being updated, based on a kind of 2020 baseline condition, and now, the current UK and Scottish government policies. Some of them are quite elderly.
Yeah, I mean, obviously all of Scotland is now covered by 2019 SNH assessment. And so we have a nice solid and fairly recent assessment covering the whole of Scotland. Some of the local ones are a bit older, and what we do is we very carefully work through them when we're doing an LVIA. So we'll look at the chronology of all the assessments available, and the degree to which they are sufficiently detailed, because obviously national ones tend to be a bit less detailed than local ones, and we marry them all up. And obviously we're looking on site as well, so we bring all of that together in terms of looking at things. They should be updated, but actually in terms of LVIA, we can work with them while they're not, because we've got to check it ourselves anyway. And most of us who've been doing it for some time can all remember having to do assessments in areas where there wasn't a landscape character assessment at all, and you had to do it yourself from scratch. At least things have moved on from there.
I suppose talking about things moving on, Anita and Paul Gill has asked the question about whether the climate emergency should influence the evolution of wind farm LVIAs, and how do LVIA practitioners respond to the climate emergency?
We keep doing what we're doing. Trying to get wind farms built. No, I mean, that's a daft answer, but actually it is the answer, because it doesn't change what's important about landscape. It might change the policy emphasis, and that's what I meant about capacity studies. So, for instance, the climate emergency doesn't influence a sensitivity study, because that's all about, is place A better than place B to put these things? It's just a ranking. But in terms of a capacity study, it will make a difference to how full is full. Because if the climate emergency means that we're more prepared to tolerate a larger amount of landscape change, then obviously the total capacity is that much higher. Mm-hmm. That's where it comes in.
Mm-hmm. I think that's where, again, methodology is so useful, because you start out with a baseline, the current situation, and you can then, if you want, project forward and say, well, if we don't do something about the climate emergency in 30 years' time, because this is on the coast, it might be very different.
Underwater.
Potentially, yes. But the important thing is you always start with the existing baseline, because that's where it's at. And yeah, for me, that's always the attraction of the assessment methodology, that you follow it through in that sort of sequential sense of where are we at, possibly looking at a future scenario, depending on the methodology and all the rest of it. But you're always looking, saying, how will the current baseline be different if the development goes ahead? So it's making sure that all the information is there, rather than maybe jumping a bit too quickly to a particular scenario.
Yeah, and we will also, where it's relevant, examine what will it be like if this development doesn't go ahead, because for some assessments there are alternatives which would be different. For instance, I've done an assessment for coastal realignment where that was quite a serious consideration about, okay, if we do this, then there's this change, but if we don't do this, there's this other change that was going to happen. And really there it's a choice of what would you rather. But that's not always a direct thing that you can draw a line up from. So for instance, for one wind farm, I can't say that all of the impacts of climate change would happen without it. And so we might gesture to the fact that, climate change is causing continuous change, but what we can't say is exactly what would happen here. And, one wind farm isn't going to make enough difference to say directly it would cause all of those consequences if we don't build this one. So that's why the arguments get a bit unbalanced, if you like, as it takes a lot of wind farms to fill the bucket of preventing climate change.
Can I pull you away from wind farms and back to housing that Neil touched on?
Yes, you'd be very welcome.
And less about the visual impact in your LVIAs, and I'm talking trees. And what we've seen recently is a move away from just protecting the root protection area around trees. And it's about now what's being called the zone of influence of a tree. And there seems to be a move to prevent any development within that zone of influence, which is based on the full height that the tree will come to. And it appears to be sterilising quite large areas if you're in a mature area, obviously where we've got large trees. And I wondered what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, no. It's an interesting question, that one, because the guidance does say that. But when I've always read it in a different way. I think it's probably the best way. To me, that's one of the basics that a landscape architect is taught when it comes to designing a new landscape, a new development with landscape incorporated. So we're all taught, think about the mature height of your tree before you select as you're selecting the particular species and as you're thinking about where you're going to put it. Yeah, which is a perfectly sensible approach to future-proofing your design. Mm-hmm. So when I read that piece of guidance, I'm reading it with that mindset. For me, it's not about development control, it's about good design. And it isn't until you say that I revisit the guidance and I think, well, yeah, I suppose if I was reading this as a tree officer, I would think it was about development control. But fundamentally, I don't think it is supposed to be. I think it's meant to be a piece of good design guidance. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't actually say that And so I think that's where this misunderstanding is arising, because what's the point in having root protection areas as well if then we impose this extra bigger one?
Yes.
Kind of. So I think it's meant to be design guidance, and I think if it's being applied in development control, it's being misapplied. And it's one of those things that I think if a landscape architect wrote the guidance in the first place, they'd have understood it as a perfectly piece of basic design guidance, because it's so basic. It's something we just all know. You know, you just taught it. And I don't think we would feel the need to say this should not be used in development control.
Yeah.
So I've got a nasty feeling it's a piece of people looking at it through different ends of the telescope. So when I'm looking at it through a landscape architect under the telescope, it's a perfectly sensible piece of guidance. However, when it's looked at through a tree protection end of the telescope, I think it's probably being misapplied, to be honest. But unfortunately, because of the way it's worded, that's not abundantly clear.
So I'm going to pick a raise here on this one as well. So this is from Catherine Brood. Do you have a view on Greenbelt designations, particularly where they're tightly drawn around settlements or areas such as Glasgow? And is there a better way of classifying land use? I mean, I think if you look at the guidance, it says, you should use Greenbelt almost as a last resort, but it seems to actually be used quite a lot. Do you have any suggestions of a better way of doing it?
I've contributed to discussions on this in the English Greenbelt context more than I have in Scotland. And obviously the Greenbelts are different. They have slightly different purposes in the two nations. I actually think Greenbelt is an early example, and it probably isn't often understood that way, it's almost a green infrastructure designation. And we know so much more about green infrastructure now and what we want to achieve from it, and what we should be looking for from it in terms of biodiversity enhancement, management of water resources, recreation. I actually think if we were to revisit it afresh with what has developed over the last 5 to 10 years in terms of thinking on green infrastructure, I think we would take a very different approach. And I think that will be better for the current times. I think Greenbelt has served its purpose and set principle, and that actually it's a really good time to have a new conversation and to cast it in that green infrastructure role, understand that that's what we really want from it. I think we'd get a lot more out of it. You'd see more enhancement, delivery, but then, balanced by release where actually it was only ever put there to prevent development and not achieve anything positive. I think it has to be there to achieve positive outcomes.
And perhaps it gives the opportunity to then look at it afresh, and the approach with perhaps, coming actually to the perfect time to do what you're suggesting.
Yeah, because actually getting the greenbelts in the right place would enable the delivery of some really good green infrastructure benefits. Yeah. You're making sure they connect in the right way, that they are suitable for delivering biodiversity benefit and making that happen. They have a nasty habit of remaining static forever, and because no development can happen, they can become degraded. Mm-hmm. That's not really the best way to look after your landscape.
I'm conscious we could probably talk all afternoon with lots of questions, but we're going to kind of draw it to a close. I suppose I've got a question, just a final question to pose you. You've obviously been involved in lots and lots of different projects, different types of development, different assessments. What's the most unusual project you've had to assess the impact of in the landscape?
I think probably the most unique was the orbit sculpture in the Olympic Park, the big red helter-skelter. It's a complete one-off, nothing like it, and obviously very large in that urban environment and all the heat around the Olympic work. It's a very different project, really challenging to work on. Also, the only time I've ever had a client disappointed when I said the impact was negligible.
You should have the wow factor.
Yeah, to be fair, that was from Alexandra Palace with the whole of London spread before you and cranes and goodness knows what else in the way. So I think it was a fair assessment, but yeah, they were a bit disappointed. Yeah, I think, and the one I found oddest was having to do landscape and visual impact assessment of forestry, because normally you're not worrying about the trees.
Yep. Yeah.
But I think that's a more common thing. I just found it weird to do because trees are trees, aren't they?
Well, can I thank you for giving up your time this afternoon? As I say, we've covered a lot of different topics, different types of and how we assess. I've just discovered that I could never be a landscape architect because you've got to be both sensitive and imaginative, and I'm not sure I qualify.
Do they claim to be those things? Oopsie.
Yeah, and thank you to everybody that's joined. As well as Neil said, it's being recorded and it will be available on the website and through, I think, Brodies YouTube. And our next event is going to be on the 29th of October. And hopefully you can catch up with us there with Fiona from the Scottish Futures Trust. And with that, I'll say goodbye.
Thank you.